I stood on the polished marble steps of the estate, holding the warm, hand-braided artisan loaf I'd woken at 4 a.m. to bake. My son, Mark, was just inside, laughing under the light of a chandelier. His new mother-in-law, Genevieve Sterling, opened the door. She didn't smile. She just stared at the bread in my hands. "Clara," she said, her voice as cold as the champagne flute in her hand. "This is my home, not a county fair bake sale. We don't serve peasant food to our guests." She motioned to a server in a crisp white jacket. "Please dispose of this." I watched, frozen, as he took my bread, my work, my craft, and carried it away like garbage. I locked eyes with Mark. He saw the whole thing, and he just turned his back, suddenly fascinated by an ice sculpture. But that explosion was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for 2 long years. That humiliation on the marble steps was the end, but the beginning of that end started 2 years earlier, the day my son, Mark, brought Becca home. They stood in my kitchen, luggage at their feet. "It's just for a few months, Mom," Mark promised, giving me that smile that had always been my kryptonite. 6 months tops, just until we save up a down payment. Becca, all sharp angles and smelling faintly of expensive perfume, had smiled too, but hers was different. It was the smile of someone assessing the value of my appliances. "Your house is so cozy, Clara," she'd said. In her world, cozy was a 4-letter word. I was just happy to have Mark home. My house, which had been quiet for years, suddenly felt full again. I gave them the main bedroom, the one with the good morning light, and moved myself into the smaller guest room. I didn't mind. What's a little inconvenience for your own son? My life had a rhythm, one I'd carved out of necessity and, eventually, out of love. It was a rhythm that started at 4 a.m. That's when my alarm would go off, vibrating on the nightstand, the only sound in the dark, sleeping house. I'd slip out of bed, pull on my work clothes, and pad barefoot into the kitchen. I'd brew a cup of strong black coffee in my old drip machine, the one Becca always side-eyed, probably comparing it to her mother's built-in stainless steel monstrosity. By 4:30 a.m., I was at the bakery. Clara's Craft, the sign read. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. I loved that pre-dawn hour. The silence of the street, the cool air, the smell of the 50-pound bags of flour. I'd turn on the big industrial ovens, and their low, mechanical hum felt like a heartbeat. Then, I'd begin. My hands, calloused and strong, would dive into the flour, water, salt, and yeast. This was my craft. This was my strength. Kneading dough is honest work. You can't fake it. You can't rush it. You put in the effort, you respect the process, and you create something real, something that nourishes people. This bakery was everything. It paid for this house. It paid for Mark's college. And as I'd glance at the framed photo of Mark in his cap and gown, I'd feel that familiar pang of pride and sacrifice. It had paid for his MBA. I remembered sitting in that sterile bank office, the loan officer pushing papers across the desk, a second mortgage. At my age, it was a terrifying risk. But Mark had been so excited, talking about leverage and future-proofing his career. So I'd picked up the pen, taken a deep breath, and signed my name. "You're making a great investment, Mom," he'd said, hugging me. I believed him. But that was before Becca. The first 6 months came and went, then a year. The down payment was never mentioned. Instead, my house began to feel less like a home and more like a high-end hotel I was failing to manage. The first thing to go was my food. I've always cooked. Simple, hearty meals. Pot roast on Sundays, spaghetti and meatballs, chicken noodle soup from scratch. It was the food I'd raised Mark on. Becca wouldn't touch it. "Oh, Clara," she'd say, looking at a steaming bowl of beef stew I'd simmered for hours. "It's just so heavy. My mother's private chef is teaching me all about clean eating." Soon, sleek white bags from DoorDash and Uber Eats began appearing on my porch at all hours. She'd pick at her $30 salads in their plastic containers while I ate my carb-heavy stew, the silence at the table growing louder every day. Then, she started on the house itself. "This whole place just smells like yeast," she complained one afternoon, walking into the kitchen while I was shaping sourdough. She was on the phone, one of her daily 2-hour calls with her mother, Genevieve. "I know, Mother. I feel like I'm living in a bread bowl." I froze, my hands white with flour. She knew I was right there. She didn't care. It was an attack on my work, my life. The very thing that was paying for the roof over her head. I looked to Mark. He just gave a nervous laugh and changed the subject. "Hey Mom, did you see the game last night?" He was a ghost in his own story, always deflecting, always avoiding, always letting her words hang in the air, unanswered. The chain of resentment, as I started calling it in my head, just got longer. One Saturday, I went to my little back garden. It was my one place of peace. I'd been gardening for 20 years. My old, worn-out gardening shoes molded to my feet, caked with mud, comfortable as slippers were gone. I found them in the trash, buried under a pile of Becca's empty Amazon boxes. When I confronted her, she barely looked up from her laptop. "Oh, those? Clara, they were disgusting. They were practically rotting. I thought I was doing you a favor. I ordered you a new pair from Zappos. They're pink." I just stood there, speechless. She hadn't just thrown away my shoes, she had thrown away my history, and she'd replaced it with something shiny, cheap, and wrong. "Becca," I said, my voice quiet, "you don't throw away another person's things." "Don't be so dramatic," she'd snapped. "They were just shoes." "Mark," I appealed to my son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just ran a hand through his hair. "Come on, Mom," she said, "she's buying you new ones." "It's not a big deal." It was a big deal. It was the final straw in a bale that had been growing for 2 years. I was a stranger in my own home, a service provider who wasn't living up to the standards of the non-paying guests. I started spending more time at the bakery. Those 4 a.m. mornings became my refuge. The smell of yeast, the one Becca despised, was the smell of my sanity. It was the smell of my independence. And I started to think. I thought about the second mortgage. I thought about the temporary stay that had no end in sight. I thought about my son, who had become a pale reflection of the confident man I'd sent to business school. And that's when I found the letter. It was 2 weeks before that awful rehearsal dinner. I was cleaning Mark's old room. They had finally announced they were moving into Genevieve's estate, and a box of his old college textbooks was still in the closet. Tucked inside a tattered economics book was an envelope. It wasn't old, it was recent. And it wasn't from a bank. It was a legal letter, embossed with the name of a high-end collections firm I'd never heard of. It was addressed to Mark. It referenced a promissory note of $150,000. I sank onto the bed, my blood running cold. I knew about that debt. It was from a stupid post-college attempt at day trading. He'd called it gambling. He'd told me a small inheritance from his aunt had completely covered it. He had lied. But the most chilling part was at the bottom of the page. The letter stated that the full debt had been purchased and was now owned by a private entity, G.S. Holdings, LLC. G.S. Genevieve Sterling. My son wasn't just moving into his mother-in-law's guest house. He was being repossessed. G.S. Holdings, Genevieve Sterling. The letters burned into my brain. All the pieces clicked into place with a horrifying metallic snap. The 2 years of disrespect, the constant complaints, the cozy insults, it wasn't just Becca's arrogance. It was a strategy. A hostile takeover of my son. The letter felt heavy in my pocket, like a piece of shrapnel. I knew I couldn't let them leave without confronting him. That's how I found myself driving to that rehearsal dinner, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, that stupid, beautiful loaf of bread on the passenger seat, the bread I'd baked for him. It felt like a prop from a different, more innocent life. I parked behind a row of gleaming black Mercedes and Range Rovers. I walked up those polished marble steps, and that's when Genevieve opened the door. She didn't smile. She just looked at the bread. "Clara," she said, her voice like ice, "this is my home, not a county fair bake sale. We don't serve peasant food to our guests." She signaled a server. "Please dispose of this." I watched the young man take my bread, my work, my 4 a.m., my love, and carry it away like trash. I locked eyes with Mark, who was standing just inside, a champagne flute in his hand. He saw it all, and he just turned his back. I couldn't let it go. Not this time. I walked past Genevieve, ignoring her outraged gasp, and followed him onto the stone porch. The party's music was a low thrum behind us. "Mark." He turned, his face pale. "Mom, now is not the time. Not the time." I kept my voice low, but it shook. I saw the letter, Mark. G.S. Holdings. $150,000. His face went from pale to ghostly white. The champagne flute trembled in his hand. "She owns you, doesn't she?" I whispered. "This isn't a move. This isn't a new start. It's an acquisition. All this time, living in my house, you were just waiting for your new owner to come and collect." He just stared out at the manicured lawn. "You don't understand. It's complicated." "What's complicated?" I pressed, the betrayal a hot acid taste in my mouth. "What's complicated about lying to your mother? About letting your fiancé and her mother treat me like dirt in my own home? That second mortgage I took out for your MBA. Does that mean anything to you? Or was that just peasant money?" "He's not lying. He's upgrading." Becca had followed us out. She stepped right between us, a silk shawl draped over her arms. Her eyes were glittering. "Becca, this is between me and my son," I said. "No," she said, taking Mark's arm. "It's between us and you. It's between the life we're going to have and the sad little life you have. My mother can give him the world. She can make his problems disappear." She smiled, a tight, cruel little smile. You gave him bread." That was it. The final, unforgivable word. I looked at Mark. I waited. This was his moment. His last chance. I willed him to say something, to defend me, to defend himself. He just stood there, a prisoner in his own tuxedo. He slowly, deliberately, pulled his arm free from Becca. I felt a tiny, stupid surge of hope. He took a step. Not toward me, toward Becca. He straightened his tie. "I have to go, Mom." He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He just walked away. He walked past his new mother-in-law, who was smiling, walked down the steps, and got into a brand new, gleaming black Mercedes that I just knew, he hadn't paid for. I stood there on the porch, alone, the sound of the party laughing behind me. I watched the taillights of that car disappear down the long, tree-lined drive. He was gone. I don't remember driving home. I remember walking into my house, and the silence was deafening. It was the same silence I'd lived in before they came, but now it felt different. It felt empty. I sat on my sofa, the one Becca had compared to a dumpster find. I sat there all night. I didn't cry. I think I was too far beyond tears. I was in a place of cold, hard clarity. The son I had raised, the boy I'd woken at 4 a.m. for, the man I'd gone into debt for, he didn't exist anymore. He had been replaced by that hollow-eyed stranger in a tuxedo. When the sun finally came up, I was still sitting there. The 4 a.m. alarm went off in the other room. It was a call to action. I got up, my joints stiff, and I went into the kitchen. I made my coffee. But I didn't go to the bakery. I went to my desk. I pulled out the paperwork for the second mortgage. I still owed a significant amount. My plan, my frugal, responsible plan, had been to chip away at it for the next 10 years. "You gave him bread." Becca's voice was rattling in my head. She'd meant it as an insult, a symbol of my small, poor life. I looked at my hands, calloused from work. I thought about my craft. I thought about the bakery, my small, solvent business that I owned. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a sad, little life. They had mistaken my kindness for stupidity. That morning, I didn't go to the bakery. I went to the bank. I sat down with the same loan officer who had looked so skeptical when I'd taken out the MBA loan for Mark. "I need another loan," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Clara, you're already leveraged with the second mortgage." "I'm not here for a personal loan." I cut him off. "I'm here for a business expansion loan. I want to buy the empty storefront next to mine. I'm going to double my capacity, buy 2 new industrial-grade ovens, and start a wholesale division." I slid my books across the table. My ledgers, my profit and loss statements, my wholesale projections. I hadn't just been grieving for the past 2 years. I'd been planning. He looked at my numbers. He looked again. His skepticism faded, replaced by respect. "Clara," he said, "these projections are ambitious, but your numbers are solid." "It's honest work," I said. "It's real." I walked out of that bank an hour later with a line of credit that made my hands shake. It was the biggest gamble of my life. But this time, I wasn't betting on my son. I was betting on myself. The next 6 months were a blur of drywall dust, contractors, and 18-hour days. I didn't just paint the walls. I tore them down. I hired 2 new bakers and a front-of-house manager. I was no longer just a baker, I was a boss. I was an owner. We had a grand reopening. The whole town came. The mayor cut a ribbon. My little bread bowl of a shop was now Clara's Craft Bakery and Cafe, and it was the hottest spot in town. We had lines out the door. I was so busy, so focused, I barely had time to think about Mark. Sometimes, late at night, I'd see a picture on social media. Mark and Becca on a yacht, or Mark and Becca at some charity gala, looking thin and glamorous. I'd feel a twinge, a dull ache, but I'd just close the app and go back to my invoices. My work was real. My success was real. And as I paid off the first installment of that new loan early, I realized something. Genevieve had been right about one thing. That rehearsal dinner was the start of a new life, just not the one she had planned. That incident with the gardening shoes was the moment I stopped feeling hurt and started feeling erased. I was a ghost in my own home, a utility. I was the electric bill. I was the running water. I was the person who woke at 4 a.m. so the house would smell like fresh bread, a smell that, to Becca, was an offense. They were finally leaving. The last 2 weeks were a flurry of expensive new luggage, boxes from Nordstrom, and excited whispered phone calls from Becca to her mother. "I know, Mother. It's finally happening. I can't wait to be home." My home, apparently, was just a bus station they'd been stuck in for 2 years. That afternoon, Mark and Becca were in the living room, sealing the last of the boxes marked Genevieve's. Their laughter was bright and brittle, a sound that didn't belong in my quiet, flower-dusted house. I went into Mark's old room, the room I had given them, the one I was finally getting back to clear out the last of their things. It was a mess. Discarded hangers, old magazines, a pair of Mark's running shoes he'd deemed too worn for his new life. In the back of the closet was a single, battered cardboard box. U of M, Econ 101 was scrawled on the side in his old handwriting. A wave of nostalgia hit me so hard it almost buckled my knees. This was my Mark. The kid I'd driven to college, the one who'd call me, panicked about exams. I smiled, pulling the box out. I just wanted to touch a piece of the sun, I remembered. I sat on the floor, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. I opened the flaps, old textbooks, a spiral notebook full of doodles, a dried-up highlighter. And tucked inside his tattered copy of macroeconomics was an envelope. It was different from the rest. It wasn't old. It was crisp, white, and embossed with the name of a legal firm I'd never heard of. It wasn't junk mail. It was addressed to Mark, at this address. My heart gave a stupid little kick. Was it a job offer? Something good? I slid my finger under the flap. My hands were trembling slightly. I pulled out the single folded sheet. It was a legal notice. I'm a baker, not a lawyer, but I know what final notice and demand for payment mean. I scanned the page, my eyes searching for the number. There it was. $150,000. I felt the air leave my lungs. $150,000. I knew that number. I felt it in my bones. It was the crushing weight of my own second mortgage. It was 10 years of my life. My mind flew back to that phone call, 5, maybe 6 years ago. Mark, his voice shaky. "Mom, I messed up. I got into some day trading. I lost. A lot." He'd called it gambling. "How much, Mark?" I'd asked, my hand gripping the bakery counter. "A lot. But it's okay. Aunt Sue's inheritance. It's just enough to cover it. I'm free and clear, Mom. I swear. I learned my lesson." He had lied. He had stood in my kitchen for 2 years, eating my food, letting me pay the bills, knowing this mountain of debt was hanging over his head. He had lied to me. I felt sick. The casualness of the lie, the ease of it, that's what hurt the most. But then, my eyes caught the fine print at the bottom of the page. The collections agency was just a servicing firm. The debt itself, the full promissory note and all associated liabilities have been purchased and are now held in their entirety by GS Holdings LLC. GS Holdings. I read it 3 times. GS. Genevieve Sterling. It wasn't a shock. It was a snap. Like a bone breaking. The entire 2-year charade replayed in my mind, but this time, in color. Becca's endless complaints about my cozy house. The DoorDash orders, the yeast smell, the discarded shoes. It wasn't arrogance. It was devaluation. It was the calculated, systematic tearing down of Mark's only other option, his only escape route. Genevieve hadn't just been a snob, she had been a predator. This whole time, my son hadn't been a guest in my home. He had been a hostage waiting for his ransom to be paid. Genevieve wasn't giving him a new life. She was foreclosing on his old one. The new Mercedes he'd been so proud of last week, the expensive watch. They weren't gifts. They were shackles. He was her property, and she had been keeping him here, in my house, letting him sponge off me until she was good and ready to collect. He wasn't her son-in-law. He was her leveraged buyout. I heard Becca laugh again from the living room, a high, piercing sound. "Clara," she called out, her voice dripping with fake brightness. "Are you sure you're coming to the party tonight? I know it's a long drive, and you probably have to wake up early to, bake, right?" I stood up slowly. The letter was a folded, tight square in my fist. My knuckles were white. I walked to the bedroom door. They were standing by the front hall, admiring their wall of matching luggage. They looked like a magazine ad. They both looked at me. "Yes, Becca," I said. My voice was perfectly calm, perfectly even. It didn't even sound like mine. "I'll be there." Mark smiled, a relieved, boyish smile that now looked grotesque to me. "Great, Mom. It's going to be amazing." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I said. "I'm even baking something special." That special bread felt heavier than it should have. Driving up the long, winding driveway to Genevieve's estate, I felt like a fool. The legal letter was at home, tucked back in its envelope, but it felt like I had it stapled to my chest. Every car I parked beside sleek, black, and worth more than my entire bakery was a reminder of the transaction. I wasn't here as a guest. I was the representative of the debt he was leaving behind. I walked up the polished marble steps. The house was blazing with light, and I could hear the high, thin sound of cocktail party laughter and the clinking of glasses. It all sounded so brittle, like it could shatter. Genevieve Sterling opened the door herself. She was wearing a cream-colored silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She didn't smile. Her eyes immediately went to the beautiful, hand-braided loaf I was holding. It was still warm, wrapped in a clean linen cloth. "Clara," she said, her voice as cold as the champagne flute in her hand. She didn't move to let me in. "Genevieve," I said, holding out the bread. "I baked this for Mark. It's his favorite." She looked at the loaf as if it were a dead animal. "This is my home, Clara, not a county fair bake sale." She turned her head slightly. "We don't serve peasant food to our guests." Peasant food. The two words just hung there in the cold night air. She motioned to a server in a crisp white jacket who was passing by with a tray. "Please dispose of this." I watched, frozen, as the young man, his face a perfect neutral mask, took my bread. He took my work, my 4 a.m., my craft, and just carried it away. I knew exactly where it was going. The trash. I looked past Genevieve, through the grand entryway. I saw Mark. He was standing near a massive fireplace, talking to a man in a tuxedo, a glass of champagne in his hand. He was laughing. He saw the entire exchange. I locked eyes with him. I saw the laugh die on his lips. I saw the flicker of panic. And then he just turned his back. He deliberately turned, finding the ice sculpture on the far wall suddenly, intensely fascinating. He had made his choice. Right there. He chose the ice sculpture over his mother. A cold rage, so pure and so sharp it almost took my breath away, cut through the humiliation. Oh no, not this time. He would not turn his back on me. I walked past Genevieve, ignoring her outraged little gasp. I didn't care about the party. I didn't care about the staring faces. I walked straight through the glittering crowd, my sensible shoes silent on their marble floor, and pushed open the glass-paned doors to the stone terrace. The music was softer out here. The air was cold. Mark. He had followed me out, probably to do damage control. He closed the door behind him. "Mom, now is not the time. You're making a scene." A scene. I kept my voice low, but it shook. "I'm making a scene? I just watched you let your mother-in-law throw a gift I made for you in the trash." "It's just bread, Mom. Why do you always have to be so dramatic? This is the most important night of my career, of our lives. Can't you just try to fit in?" That's when the letter, the knowledge of it, came boiling up. Fit in? You mean fit in with the woman who owns you? I saw the letter, Mark. His face went from annoyed to ghostly white. The blood just drained out of him. What letter? I don't know what you're talking about. GS Holdings, LLC, I said. The name felt disgusting on my tongue. $150,000. You lied to me. For 6 years you lied. You let me think you were free and clear from that gambling debt. He just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. He had no words. He was trapped. This isn't a move, is it? I whispered, the full, ugly truth finally coming out. This isn't a new start. It's an acquisition. All this time, living in my house, eating my food, you were just her collateral, waiting to be collected. And all her little insults, all of Becca's complaining, that was just to make sure I was too peasant to ever be an option again. You don't understand, he finally choked out, his voice desperate. It's complicated. She saved me. She saved you. I almost laughed. I'm the one who took out a second mortgage on my house for your MBA, an education you are now using to be this puppet. Does that mean anything to you? Or was that just peasant money? 2. He's not a puppet, he's upgrading. Becca. She had come out, a silk shawl wrapped tightly around her arms. Her eyes were glittering with a kind of triumphant fury. Becca, this is between me and my son, I said. No, she said, walking over and taking Mark's arm, claiming him. It's between us and you. It's between the life we're going to have and the sad, little life you'll always have. My mother can give him the world. She can make his problems disappear. She leaned in, and her smile was the cruelest thing I had ever seen. You gave him bread. That was it. The final, killing blow. The word bread, my life's work, used as a weapon. I looked at Mark. I just looked at him, waiting. This was it. This was the moment, his last chance to be the son I had raised. I willed him to say something, to defend me, to defend himself. He stood there for a long second, a prisoner between the two of us. Then he slowly, deliberately, put his arm around Becca's waist. He straightened his new, expensive tie. He would not meet my eyes. I have to go, Mom. That was all. Not, I'm sorry. Not, let's talk later. Just, I have to go. He turned, with Becca on his arm, and they walked back into the party, back into the light and the laughter, the glass door clicking shut behind them, leaving me alone in the cold. I stood there on the terrace for a long time. I don't remember the drive home. I remember walking into my small, quiet house, the house that smelled of yeast. I sat on my sofa, the one Becca had compared to a dumpster find, and I watched the sun come up. I didn't cry. I was empty of tears. I was in a place of cold, hard clarity. The son I had raised, the boy I'd baked for, the man I'd gone into debt for. He was gone. He had been bought and paid for. The 4 a.m. alarm went off in my bedroom, vibrating on the nightstand. It was a call to action. I had a business to run, and I had a debt of my own to pay. That debt, the second mortgage, the one I had signed for Mark's future, it was a chain I had willingly wrapped around my own neck for him, and last night he had used the last link of it to hang me. I didn't sleep. When my 4 a.m. alarm went off, I was already in the kitchen, dressed, my coffee brewed. The house was silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt mine. I went to the bakery. The smell of yeast and flour, the smell Becca had despised, was the smell of my independence. It was the smell of my trade, my skill, my power. Peasant food, Genevieve had called it. I looked at my big industrial oven. I looked at my proofing racks. I thought about the lines that formed on Saturday mornings, the local restaurants that bought my sourdough. I wasn't a peasant. I was an artisan. And they had mistaken my small, manageable business for a small, manageable life. They had mistaken my contentment for a lack of ambition. I pulled out my ledgers. I worked all morning, before the sun came up, not just baking but calculating. I ran the numbers. I looked at the for lease sign in the dusty window of the empty insurance office next door. I had idly dreamed about expanding for years, but I was always playing it safe. I was always putting Mark's potential future ahead of my own. I had been paying for his MBA while he was accruing a secret, shameful gambling debt. I had been baking bread to pay down a loan for his education while he was living in my house, letting his fiancée mock the very work that was keeping him afloat. No more. At 9 a.m., I walked out of the bakery, wiping flour from my hands, and walked straight into the local community bank. I sat down with Mr. Henderson, the same loan officer who had looked at me with that mixture of pity and respect when I'd signed the papers for Mark's MBA loan. "Clara," he said, looking surprised, "what can I do for you?" I didn't plead. I didn't grieve. I slid my business ledgers, my profit and loss statements, and a new detailed proposal across his desk. "I'm not here about that mortgage, Mr. Henderson," I said. "I'm here for a business expansion loan. I'm leasing the space next door. I'm buying 2 new convection ovens and a 20-quart industrial mixer. I'm starting a wholesale division to supply every hotel and restaurant in this county." He looked at my proposal. He looked at my sales figures. He looked at my projections for the wholesale accounts. His eyebrows went up. "Clara," he said, and this time there was no pity in his voice. "These numbers are solid. This is ambitious. It's a good investment," I said, my voice even. "I'm a good investment. My work is real. My product is real. And I'm not betting on potential anymore. I'm betting on me." He looked at me for a long moment. He'd seen me in here for years, the humble town baker. He was seeing someone new. He tapped the papers. "You're already leveraged with that second mortgage." "That mortgage," I said, "was a personal risk I took for a bad asset. This is a business opportunity. And I'm going to use the profits from this expansion to pay off that personal debt in 18 months. He smiled. A real, genuine smile. He stamped the first page. "Let's get you that line of credit." I walked out of that bank feeling 10 feet tall. The grief was still there, a cold, hard stone in my gut, but it wasn't pulling me down anymore. I was using it as ballast. The next 3 months were a blur of drywall dust, screaming saws, and 18-hour days. I hired contractors. I was there before they arrived and after they left. I pointed. I directed. I signed invoices. I negotiated with suppliers. I didn't just paint the walls. I tore them down. The for lease sign came down, and a new one went up. Clara's Craft Bakery and Cafe, expanding soon. I hired a young, ambitious pastry chef from the city and a no-nonsense front-of-house manager named Maria. I wasn't just Clara the baker anymore. I was Clara the boss. On a bright Saturday in June, we had our grand reopening. The mayor came and cut a big red ribbon. The local paper took a picture. The new space was beautiful, clean, bright, with a gleaming espresso machine, a long pastry case, and bistro tables in the window. And it was packed. The line was out the door and around the corner. All the people who had loved my peasant food for years were there, bringing their friends, buying dozens of croissants, ordering lattes, sitting and talking. My bakery, my sad little life, had become the beating heart of the town. I stood by the new ovens, the heat warm on my face, watching the controlled chaos. Maria was running the register. My new bakers were plating desserts. It was working. I was so busy, so focused, I barely had time to think about Mark. Sometimes, late at night, I'd see a picture of them on social media. Mark and Becca on a yacht, looking thin and angular. Mark and Becca at some charity gala, his arm tight around her waist. He looked strained. But I'd just close the app and go back to my invoices. My success was real. It was tangible. I could smell it. That night, I paid the first double payment on that second mortgage. It felt good. It felt like taking my power back, $1 at a time. Genevieve had been right about one thing. That night was the start of a new life, just not the one she had planned. It wasn't the one they had planned either. I didn't know it at the time, of course. For those first few months, all I saw was what they wanted me to see, what Genevieve allowed the world to see. My Facebook feed, which had once been quiet, was suddenly flooded with their new life. It was a perfectly curated, high-gloss performance. There was Becca on a yacht, her hair blowing in the wind, the water a shade of blue that didn't look real. There was Mark, clinking a champagne glass at some charity gala, his tuxedo sharp, his smile looking brittle. There was the new Mercedes, gleaming in the long, private driveway. They looked thin. They looked glamorous. They looked, to the entire world, like they had won. I'd look at those pictures late at night, after cleaning the espresso machine and locking up the bakery. I'd feel that dull ache, the phantom limb of a son I no longer had. But underneath the ache, there was something else. a question. Mark's smile, in every single photo, never reached his eyes. It was a grimace of success. Becca's posts were too frequent, the captions too desperate. Living the dream. So number blessed to have a mother like Genevieve. It was all a performance. It wasn't until months later, after the entire fragile house of cards had collapsed, that I finally pieced together what their dream life had actually looked like. I learned it from neighbors who had friends who worked staff at the estate, and eventually, from the raw, broken confessions. Their dream life was a golden cage. They weren't living in the main mansion, oh no, that was for Genevieve. They were living in the guest house. Now, the guest house on Genevieve's estate was nicer than my entire house, but the message was clear. They were satellite personnel. They were not family. They were high-class tenants. And tenants was the right word. Genevieve Sterling didn't give anything for free. That was her core philosophy. She believed in leverage. She believed in teaching people their value. Mark's very first paycheck from his new high-powered job, the one Genevieve had graciously gotten for him, was gone before it even hit his bank account. Genevieve had presented them with a lease, a GS Holdings LLC lease for the guest house. I can just picture her, sitting behind her massive mahogany desk, pushing the paper toward them with one perfectly manicured finger. "This is how the real world works, darlings," she would have said. Their rent was $10,000 a month. That didn't include the itemized estate fees, security, landscaping, a staffing contribution for the housekeepers, utilities, even a pool and tennis court maintenance fee, though they were rarely allowed to use them. Mark was making more money than he ever had in his life, and he was poorer than he'd ever been. He was drowning. That $150,000 gambling debt she'd bought, that was just the anchor. The rent was the water she was pouring on his head. He was working 80-hour weeks, not to get ahead, but just to survive the lifestyle she was forcing them to live. He wasn't a golden boy executive. He was her most high-strung, over-leveraged asset. He was a glorified assistant, running her errands, managing her personal portfolio, and terrified of making a single mistake. But the one who broke first, that was Becca. Becca thought she was the princess who had finally come home. She learned very quickly that she was just the guest house's chief ornament. Her new life was a prison of impossible standards. Her days were governed by Genevieve. Her job was to be the perfect daughter-in-law to Genevieve's friends. The charity events weren't parties, they were inspections. I learned about one dinner party they'd hosted. Becca had spent all day getting ready, desperate to impress. She came down wearing a new dress, one she'd spent her last dollar on. Genevieve was in the foyer, adjusting a flower arrangement. She didn't even look up. She just said, "Is that what you're wearing?" "It's new," Becca said, her voice small. "It's designer." Genevieve finally turned. She looked Becca up and down, her eyes lingering for a beat too long. "It's fine, if you're going to a cocktail party in Ohio. The cut of it is terribly middle class. You look like—" She'd paused, tapping a finger on her chin. "You know, you look just like your mother-in-law. You look like Clara." And there it was. The ultimate insult. The very woman Becca had spent 2 years mocking, the peasant she had despised, was now the new baseline for her failure. Becca ran upstairs and cried so hard she was too puffy to come down for the party at all, a failure that Genevieve punished with 2 straight days of icy silence. They were trapped. They were walking on eggshells in a house with 30-foot ceilings. The walls were paper-thin. They were isolated. Genevieve had systematically discouraged them from seeing any of their old friends. "They just don't fit with our circle, darling." They did not, darling. They were starving. Literally. The main house's kitchen was off limits. Their guest house kitchen had a tiny European-style refrigerator that was stocked by Genevieve's staff with bottled water, kale, and tiny, unsatisfying portions of pre-cooked quinoa. I would think about Becca, in her designer dress, in that sterile guest house, probably fantasizing about a thick, warm slice of my peasant food. They were putting on the performance of their lives for social media, while behind the scenes, they were being eaten alive. They had traded a warm, loving home, a home that smelled like yeast and life, for a cold, marble mausoleum, and they were paying for the privilege. They were in their own compression chamber, and I knew, as I saw another picture of Mark, his face gaunt, his smile a rictus, that it was only a matter of time before it all exploded. That kind of pressure, that kind of manufactured high-stakes performance, can't last. A thread that's pulled that tight doesn't just fray, it snaps. And the snap came, as these things so often do, on a quiet Sunday afternoon. While I was wiping down the counters of my bustling, joy-filled bakery, closing out a record-breaking weekend, Mark was in his sterile guest house, hunched over a laptop. His new life was a relentless 80-hour-a-week nightmare. He wasn't a high-powered executive. He was Genevieve's personal portfolio manager, her tech support, and, when she felt like it, her errand boy. He hadn't had a solid meal in weeks. He was living on the approved, portion-controlled quinoa salads and a bitter cocktail of adrenaline and terror. The terror of the $150,000 debt he owed her, and the terror of the $10,000 a month in rent he was failing to keep up with. He was a thoroughbred, as he'd once told me, but he was being run into the ground. That Sunday he was supposed to be at leisure, which in Genevieve's world meant being on call. He was trying to reconcile a massive, multi-million-dollar account for GS Holdings before he had to put on a tuxedo for a 5 p.m. charity auction. He was exhausted. His hands were shaking. His eyes were so blurry from staring at spreadsheets that the numbers were starting to swim. He saw a sell order for a volatile tech stock. 50,000 shares. He was also, at that exact moment, on his phone, trying to confirm Genevieve's 4:15 p.m. hair appointment. He was distracted. He was beaten down. His finger hit the key. He didn't sell 50,000 shares. He bought 50,000 shares. He clicked execute just as Becca walked in, her voice high and tight. "Mark, what are you doing? Mother's car is waiting. We're going to be late." He slammed the laptop shut. He didn't even realize what he'd done. He didn't find out until the next morning, Monday. The market opened, and that specific tech stock, the one he'd accidentally bought, nosedived. A bad earnings report came out at 9:31 a.m. It was a bloodbath. Mark saw the notifications lighting up his phone. He saw the red, downward-pointing arrows. He opened his laptop. He saw the confirmation, and he saw the loss. By 10 a.m., his simple distracted keystroke had cost GS Holdings over $1.2 million. He spent the entire day in a cold sweat, vomiting in the guesthouse's pristine marble bathroom, trying to figure out a way to hide it, to fix it, to trade his way out of it. But he couldn't. It was too big. At 5 p.m., his phone chimed. It wasn't a call. It was a text from Genevieve. "My office. Now." He walked from the guest house to the main house. It was the longest walk of his life. The air was still. The manicured lawns looked fake. She wasn't in her grand, mahogany-paneled home office. She was in the sunroom, a vast, cold space of glass and white furniture. She was sitting in a white armchair, calmly sipping an iced tea. She didn't look angry. She looked bored. That was so much worse. "Mark," she said, not looking up as he entered. "Sit." He sat on the edge of a white sofa that probably cost more than his old car. He felt like he was suffocating. She slowly, deliberately, placed her glass on a coaster. "I bought your debt, Mark," she said, her voice conversational, "as an investment in a thoroughbred. I saw potential. I expected a certain level of performance. I expected a return." She picked up a single sheet of paper from the table beside her. It was the trade confirmation. She didn't hand it to him. She just held it. "This," she said, giving the paper a little shake, "is not thoroughbred performance. This is sloppy. It's common." The word hung in the air. Common, the same unspoken word they had always used for me. This is the kind of mistake a baker would make. Someone who doesn't understand the real world. "Genevieve, please," he started, his voice cracking. "I can fix it. I was tired. I was distracted. I'll work for free. She held up a single, perfectly manicured hand. The diamond on her finger flashed. "Stop." The word was not a request. It was a command. "You can't fix this. You're fired, of course. That's the least of it." She leaned forward, and for the first time, her eyes were not bored. They were like chips of ice. "Your employment contract was, naturally, tied to the repayment terms of your promissory note. By breaching your contract with such gross negligence, you've triggered the acceleration clause." What does that mean?" Mark whispered. "It means," Genevieve said, standing up, that the full amount, $150,000 plus accrued interest, penalties, and this new $1.2 million deficit you've created is due in full. By close of business tomorrow. He just stared at her. He was speechless. He was ruined. You see, Mark, she said, walking to the window and looking out at her perfect garden. I don't tolerate bad investments, not in the market and not in people. You're a bad investment. You're not the man I thought you were. You're just Clara's son, after all. She turned. You and Becca will be off the property within the hour. Security will escort you. Security escorted him. That was the part I learned later. Genevieve didn't just leave him to find his own way out. 2 guards, in crisp, dark uniforms with the GS logo embroidered on the breast, were waiting for him outside the sunroom. They didn't touch him. They didn't have to. They just flanked him, their presence a silent, suffocating force, as he walked the long, cold marble hall back to the guest house. He stumbled in, his face so white, so utterly broken, that Becca, who was in the middle of zipping up an evening gown, actually stopped. Mark? What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost. Mother is waiting. We're going to be late. He just looked at her, his eyes hollow. She fired me. What? Becca's voice was a thin, sharp shriek. What do you mean, fired? You can't be fired. You're family. No, Mark whispered, a terrible, dawning realization on his face. No, we're not. We're a bad investment. She called me Clara's son. As if summoned by the words, one of the guards knocked firmly on the guest house door. You have 10 minutes to vacate with your personal items. 10 minutes. 10 minutes to end a life they had betrayed everything for. The next few moments, as they described them later, were a blur of pure animal panic. There was no careful folding. There was no organizing. It was a frantic, ugly scramble. Becca was sobbing, just shoving $1,000 dresses into a suitcase, the hangers snapping. Mark was yanking drawers open, throwing his expensive, useless cufflinks and silk ties into a duffel bag. They were grabbing things. A half-empty bottle of champagne from the fridge, a stack of engraved invitations to parties they could no longer attend. All the trappings of a life that had just evaporated. My jewelry, Becca cried, fumbling with her jewelry box. There's no time, Becca. Just go. Mark was practically dragging her. The guards didn't help. They stood by the door, arms crossed, watching. They carried their own bags. They weren't driven down the long, winding drive in the Mercedes. They walked. They dragged their designer luggage, the little wheels bumping and clattering on the perfect hand-laid cobblestones. And then they were at the gate. The massive black iron gates. A guard pushed a button, and the gates slid open. They were ushered out, and the gate slid shut behind them with a heavy, final thud. They were on the curb, a public road, outside the walls. And then, as if on cue, it started to rain. Not a drizzle, but a cold, miserable, soaking rain. There they stood, Mark in his $1,000 suit, now getting damp. Becca in her silk blouse, her perfect hair starting to frizz, her mascara beginning to run. And surrounding them, like a fortress of their own failure, was a mountain of matched, monogrammed designer luggage. This is insane, Becca said, her voice trembling with rage. She can't do this. I'm calling her. She pulled out her phone. Don't bother, Mark said, his voice dead. She's not going to answer. She's cut us off. We'll see about that. Becca furiously tapped on her phone. I'm calling an Uber Black. We'll go to the Four Seasons. We'll. Her thumb froze. She stared at the screen. Payment method declined. What? She whispered. She tried again. Declined. She tried her personal Amex, the one Genevieve had gifted her. Card frozen. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide with a new, colder terror. Mark, my cards are all declined. She shut them off. All of them. Mark slowly, like an old man, pulled out his own wallet. He looked at his platinum card. He didn't even bother trying. He knew. Genevieve didn't just fire him. She erased him. The joint accounts, the credit lines, all of it was tied to GS Holdings. Cash, Becca said, her voice frantic. Do you have any cash? A debit card. It was a company account, Becca. It's all gone. He frantically dug through his pockets, pulling out. A $50 bill. A $20. A few crumpled dollar 1 second. The last of his walking around money. Becca tore through her own expensive purse, past the $500 lipstick, and found, in a side pocket, a single $100 bill she'd stashed for tips. That was it. Between them, they had about $170, and a mountain of designer luggage on a soaking wet curb with nowhere to go. The thoroughbreds, the upgraded life, the couple who had looked down on my peasant food, they were standing in the rain, broke, homeless, and utterly defeated. They weren't just at rock bottom. They were beneath it. And I, of course, knew nothing of this. I was busy. While they were standing on that curb, arguing over their last $100 as the rain soaked their designer luggage, I was running my Saturday dinner service. While they were checking into a no-name, off-highway motel that smelled like stale cigarettes and bleach, paying cash, I was asleep, for the first time in years, in my own bed, the big one, the one with the good light. While they spent the next 2 days in that humid, dark room, the terror setting in, I was at a local farmer's market, laughing with other vendors, negotiating a new contract for my artisan loaves with a high-end gourmet grocery. While they were walking to a pawn shop, Becca's hands shaking as she slid her grandmother's diamond earrings, the good ones, not the ones from Genevieve under the glass, I was hiring a new part-time barista. While they were counting the few $100 bills they got, a fraction of the jewelry's worth, I was counting the thick, satisfying stack of 20s and 50s from my cash register. My business was thriving. My life was my own. I was paying off that second mortgage so fast, Mr. Henderson at the bank had called to congratulate me. I was free. They, meanwhile, were in a prison of their own making. The pawn shop money lasted another 4 days, another cheap motel, more rain. And then, one rainy Tuesday night, it all came to a head. The bakery was warm. It was 8 p.m., and we were closing. My manager, Maria, was wiping down the gleaming new espresso machine. The lights were turned down low, but the place was still buzzing with the leftover energy of a good, busy night. Outside, the rain was lashing against the new, floor-to-ceiling plate glass windows. I was at the register, cashing out. I loved this part of the day. Counting the receipts, the stack of bills, the physical proof of my success. It was real. It was tangible. I'd built this. Me. My peasant food. That's when I saw them. At first, they were just 2 figures huddled in the doorway, trying to get out of the downpour, their backs to me. I sighed, thinking it was just some local homeless folks looking for a handout. I grabbed a couple of unsold pastries and put them in a bag. It was the decent thing to do. I walked to the door, and as I got closer, the figures turned, and I stopped. My hand froze on the doorknob. It wasn't them, not the glossy, curated people from the Facebook posts. These people were wrecked. It was Mark. And it was Becca. But it was a version of them I'd never seen. They were soaked to the bone. Their clothes. They weren't designer. They were cheap, mismatched sweatshirts and jeans, dark with rain, clinging to their frames. They were so thin. Becca's beautiful, sharp face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, her hair a limp, wet snarl. Mark's eyes were huge and haunted in his pale face. They weren't looking at me. They were staring, mouths open, through the glass. They were staring at the bakery. I realized, with a jolt, that they had no idea. They hadn't seen it. They were staring at the new, bright, bustling cafe. They were staring at the warm lights, the happy employees, the gleaming pastry cases, the Clara's Craft logo etched beautifully on the glass. This wasn't the sad little bake sale they had left. This wasn't the bread bowl Becca had mocked. This was a success. And they were on the outside of it, in the dark, in the pouring rain, looking in. Becca saw me first. Her eyes widened, and I saw a flash of something ugly, pure, unadulterated shock. Then Mark turned. His gaze met mine, and I saw it all. The shame, the desperation, the defeat. I didn't gasp. I didn't run. I didn't feel a surge of pity. I just felt cold and calm. I turned my back on them. I walked back to the register. Maria looked at me, confused. "Mrs. Clara, is something wrong?" "No, Maria," I said, my voice perfectly even. I carefully finished strapping the cash bundles. I clicked the register drawer shut. I turned the key, Click. I took the bank bag. I picked up my keys. I walked back to the front door. They were still there, frozen, watching me. They looked like two drowned ghosts. I put my key in the lock. I turned it. The deadbolt slid home with a heavy final thunk. I looked at them through the glass. Then, I unlocked the deadbolt again. I pulled the door open, just a few inches. A blast of cold, wet air hit my face, smelling of rain and desperation. They both flinched, like stray animals expecting to be kicked. I just looked at them. At my son. At the woman who had destroyed him. Yes, I said. That single word, yes, hung in the cold, wet air between us. It was Mark who finally broke. He took a staggering step forward, his hand half raised, as if to plead. Mom, please. His voice was a raw croak, a sound I hadn't heard since he was a child who'd woken from a nightmare. We have nowhere to go. She kicked us out. I lost my job. We're broke, Mom. We have nothing. Becca, who had been hiding behind his shoulder, pushed forward. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, theatrical panic. Tears were streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. Clara, please, she sobbed. We made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. We were so wrong. Please, just let us in. Just for tonight. It's so cold. I looked at her. The same woman who had compared my home to a dumpster. The same woman who had sneered at my work. A mistake, I said, my voice perfectly quiet, cutting right through her sobs. She stopped, her breath catching. A mistake, Becca, is when you add too much salt to the dough. A mistake is burning a batch of croissants. I took a step back, holding the door, letting the cold air wash over me. What you did was a choice. You looked at two lives, and you made a calculated, strategic choice. You chose status over family. You chose a lie over the truth, and it was just a bad investment. Please, Mark begged. He was crying now, his shoulders shaking. Don't do this. I'm your son. You have to help us. I'm your son. He lunged for the door. I put my hand flat against it, stopping it from moving an inch. He looked at me, his eyes wide, shocked by my strength. No, Mark, I said. My voice was no longer quiet. It was as cold and hard as the steel ovens behind me. I don't. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain. You don't, he whispered, as if he couldn't comprehend the words. No, I don't have to. That's the part you never understood. I fed you, clothed you, and housed you for 2 years out of love. You thought it was an obligation. I looked past him, at Becca, who was staring at me, her face a mask of dawning horror. I know about the debt, Mark, I said. His head snapped up. His face went from desperate to guilty. I've known all along, since the day you left. I found the letter. G.S. Holdings, $150,000. Becca let out a tiny choked sound. You knew. I knew, I said. I knew that every time you sneered at my food, you were just devaluing his only escape plan. I knew that every time you called my house cozy, you were just locking his cage. You weren't his fiancée, Becca. You were his warden. I turned my full attention to my son. You stood on that porch, in your brand new tuxedo, and you let that woman throw my work in the trash. You let her humiliate me. You turned your back on me. You chose her, not because you loved her, but to protect your own skin. You weren't her son-in-law, Mark. You were her collateral. I pointed to the glowing sign above the door, to my name. You both thought my bread was peasant food. You were right. They stared at me, confused. It is peasant food. It's the food of people who work for a living. It's the food of people who build something real, from scratch, with their own 2 hands. I held up my own, calloused, flour-dusted hands. It's the food of a life you two know nothing about, and you are no longer welcome in it. Mom, wait, Mark yelled as I began to push the door closed. I'm afraid we're closed, I said. Please leave. Clara, no, Becca shrieked, lunging forward. I shut the door. I didn't slam it. I just closed it firmly. I turned the deadbolt. The thunk of the lock sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I have ever heard. They pounded on the glass. Their faces were pressed against it, distorted by the rain and their own agony. They were screaming my name. Maria, my manager, was staring, her hand over her mouth. Mrs. Clara, who... I didn't answer. I turned my back on the door. I turned my back on their screaming faces. I walked past Maria, back to the register, and picked up the heavy bank bag. "Good work tonight, Maria," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "I'll see you in the morning." I walked out the back door, into the alley, and got into my car. I didn't look back. I just drove home. I drove home. The rain had stopped. I parked my car, walked into my quiet, clean house, and for the first time in 2 years, I slept. I didn't dream. My 4 a.m. alarm went off, vibrating on the nightstand. But it wasn't a burden. It was an invitation. The sun came up later, streaming through the big, clean windows of my cafe. The place was packed. The espresso machine was hissing. People were laughing, and the air was filled with the warm, rich smell of coffee and baked bread. I was in the middle of the beautiful, controlled chaos, handing a regular customer a crackling, golden brown loaf of sourdough. My peasant food. "This is the best bread in the state, Clara," he said, smiling. "Don't know what you do, but don't ever stop." "I won't," I said, smiling back. I looked around. At my staff, at my customers, at the full pastry case, at the walls I had rebuilt. I had built this. Not from spite, but from my own 2 hands. From my own strength. Clara had finally learned that self-respect is the one ingredient you can never compromise on. She had built a life and a business that was 100% hers, and that was the sweetest success of all. So let me ask you, if life handed you a brand new unwritten page, would you have the courage to turn to it? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the hardest of times.